feel like somebody's looking over my shoulder, paying attention to every word, so please, folks, let's keep it clean and to the point. So first, welcome to everybody. On behalf of the Board of Governors and Press Club, I want to greet you here in this wonderful place. Press Club, 136 years old. We see our current role as preserving the history, the legacy, the traditions of journalism, not just in Milwaukee, but across this country. And one of the most important of those is the watchdog role that the media plays in our democracy. And those of you who knew Bob Wills, Mr. Wills, I never called him Bob, Mr. Wills, he played such a powerful role, not just in Wisconsin, but nationally. You'll hear more about that. Press Club, we're pleased to tell you, is in excellent financial condition. It will carry on for another 136 years. Great job on the part of the Board of Governors to keep all that going. You have a lot of really great programming, but also the endowment, which is a separate foundation affiliated with us, but separate. They're doing well financially, and again, because the Press Club donates to them along with other people every year. So we're all about creating greater awareness, support, education in journalism, but in particular the advocacy role on behalf of open government, open records, and the kinds of crusading journalism that Bob Wills represented. So I know Jim Nelson said to me a few days ago, Bob probably was the last of that great American tradition of crusading editors. Not because there aren't more available, but because of what's happened with our newspapers and even our broadcast media. So how do we carry that on? Well, we'll figure it out. It may be digital, it may be something else. We haven't quite figured all that out yet. But important to retain the memory and the history of what that was all about. So that's what we hope you'll help us do tonight. And I want to emphasize that we're not here to listen to speeches. Please, no eulogies. We want anecdotes, personal remembrances of the man. And if you drag on too long, I'll be standing by to grab the mic. There's a few people who have been invited to make remarks, so we'll have them up first, but then we'll open the mic up to anybody from the audience. We all have a number of stories about Bob Wills, but please, when you come up, it's like going to family dinner, one course at a time, and you can come up for second to third later, okay? But again, I'll be the person monitoring how we're doing. So first up, I'd like to get Paul Hayes up here, who we at the Sentinel called it Paper B. And we always competed like sibling rivals. So good friend and one of the best guys I met in journalism. Here you go, Paul.
Carl, thank you.
Carl, that mic isn't on.
Is this, can you hear me? I usually have a pretty good voice.
I have another mic.
Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Good. I timed this with my wife at 16 minutes. If you want me to cut it by 4, I'll take the last 3 paragraphs off. Or not. Thanks very much. I'm very honored to be able to do this. My first encounter with Bob Wills was in March 1962, before most of you were born. I had just joined the Milwaukee Journal and Bob was already assistant city editor, having joined the Journal 11 years earlier. When he learned that I had grown up in Springfield, Illinois, and was named Hayes, and was the son of the owner of a Hayes chicken hatchery in Springfield, he asked if I knew Patty Hayes, daughter of Scott Hayes, owner of a Hayes chicken hatchery in Bloomington. Of course I did. She was my beautiful older cousin. Bob and his wife, Sherry, had been her good friends in Bloomington. So our relationship had an amiable beginning, and in the couple of months that I worked under him at the Journal, I never did get acquainted with the aggressive, pioneering editor at the Sentinel who terrified young reporters and whose reputation occasionally found its way over the walkway and entered the far more sedate Journal newsroom. But I didn't get a chance to work directly for him later. On May 27, 1962, the newspaper guild struck the Sentinel. The guild had threatened strikes before, but these were met by the Hearst Corporation's vow to sell the paper if there was a walkout. It was not a bluff. When 350 employees of the editorial, advertising, business, and circulation departments walked out, Milwaukee was without a Sentinel for the first time since its founding in 1837, and Hearst put the paper on the market. Irwin Meyer, the Journal's publisher, had already turned down a quiet offer from Hearst to buy the Sentinel for $7 million. Even so, Meyer was determined that Milwaukee would have a morning newspaper reluctantly published by the Journal Company if no one else bought the Sentinel. Rumors circulated that the Chicago Tribune was interested, as was a group of conservative Milwaukee industrialists. But when both the Tribune and the industrialists became convinced that neither could run a paper profitably, Hearst dropped the price to $3 million and cut the deal with the Journal Company. The company didn't get much of immediate value for its money. The Sentinel name, a circulation list of about 155,000, or less than half the number of the Journal's daily subscribers, some bright red masonite covered desks in deplorable condition, and the right to run some Hearst syndicated features for 3 years. The Journal assumed the balance of lease for the Sentinel's building, paid it off, and emptied it out. The sale was ratified on July 19th, and top editors for the new Sentinel were picked from the Journal's newsroom. Harvey Schwander, the Journal's assistant managing editor, was named executive editor of the new Sentinel. Harry Sonneborn, city editor of the Journal, became managing editor, and Bob Wills, assistant city editor of the Journal, became city editor. Management moved fast to get the first Sentinel delivered. The latest edition of the Journal announced the sale on the day it was ratified, a Thursday. It quoted management, that would be Meyer, as saying that the Journal Company had reluctantly bought its last rival in Milwaukee. It said the Sentinel editorial staff would work in the 4th floor of an older building south on 4th Street that was connected by an overhead walkway above the alley. The Sunday Sentinel was discontinued. The two newspapers were to share Journal presses, compositors, artists, and photographers, the library, advertising, and circulation departments, and the cafeteria. Other than that, the newspapers would have separate newsrooms and editorial staffs. Hiring began immediately and continued over the weekend. By the next week, 55 news professionals from the old Sentinel were on the paper. The first new Sentinel was to be delivered on Monday morning. There weren't yet enough people hired to put out a paper, so management asked 6 Journal reporters to help. They included Colleen and Robert Deshawn, Lori Van Dyke, Jim Weehart, Frank Alcofer, and me. We arrived after lunch on a sleepy Sunday afternoon. I pondered the irony. I had arrived in Milwaukee from the Des Moines Register a few months earlier, eager to work in a city with 2 independent dailies and to work days, not evenings. Now I was doing neither. The old Sentinel's appearance was mostly retained, which meant that each edition was crowned by a screaming 8-column headline, whether or not the news justified it. Nothing that day supported such a headline until mid-afternoon, when a cloud darkened western Milwaukee County and unleashed a downpour of high winds. Will sent me to West Allis, where I ran into, luckily, R.W. Harms, who was also bored that afternoon, chief of the National Weather Service in Milwaukee. He confirmed that a small tornado had lifted a warehouse roof and set it down a few inches off kilter. There it is. Dave Vogel said that between the state and the local edition, this said state and then it moved to area. Thanks, Dave. I interviewed a few neighbors and called the details into Wayne Yetke, recently of Hearst Sentinel, who blended my information into a larger weather story that went under the banner. Sentinel readers woke up on July 23rd to a paper of 44 pages, far fatter than usual for a Monday Sentinel. It was heavy with classified and other advertising and rich with local and national news, all reflecting the prosperity of its new owner. By mid-August, the new Sentinel staff had settled into a routine, and we journal temps were given the option of remaining with the Sentinel or returning to the Journal. Only Ochofer and I returned. Of course, the fear among Milwaukeeans, especially its business community, would be that the Journal would impose what they saw as its liberal bent on the Sentinel, and the city would basically become a one-owner newspaper town with no checks or balances. Surprising even to us in the business was the intensity of competition between the Journal and the Sentinel, far more aggressive than before the purchase. Publisher Meyer had promised that the morning and evening papers would operate as independent voices, and the editors of both papers took him at his word. Purchase of the Sentinel rejuvenated its demoralized staff, and it sprang to life. Harry Hill became city editor of the Journal, and by God, he was not going to be beaten by the upstart Wills. The papers assigned separate reporters to each important governmental building and public meetings. Both papers kept their traditional editorial identities. The Journal was centrist liberal, the Sentinel centrist conservative. There was overlap. Regarding abortion, both papers were pro-choice. For the next 3 decades, newspaper competition was never keener in Milwaukee. Reporters at each paper dreaded being spooked, and the truly cursed risked demotion and even firing. Nervous editors found space for the flimsiest of stories, lest the opposition publish it first. The Sentinel's daily circulation grew by 10,000 papers. The Journal's weekday circulation held steady at 373,000, while Sunday's circulation soared beyond 560,000. This was the peak. Both papers were passionate about guarding the community's reputation for the honesty and competence that Wisconsin state government and Milwaukee city and county governments then were known for nationally. That reputation was the legacy of the Progressive Party of the late Robert La Follette and the half-century of socialist mayors Emil Seidel, Daniel Cohn, and Frank Zeidler, who governed the city so openly, so honestly, and frugally that it attracted national attention and furnished amusement for Chicago journalists 90 miles south. What was remarkable after the purchase was that by all measures, Milwaukee was better served by 2 competing dailies under one ownership than it had been with 2 dailies under 2 owners. For this, I credit Bob Wills and Harry Hill, both assistant city editors who for years sat side by side before the purchase, but who were committed to beat the hell out of each other after the purchase. I know this from personal experience because Bob Deschamps and I were both covering the Milwaukee County Expressway Commission, and we were as competitive as they come. It was true also of Tom Lubenow and Jim Wehart, former colleagues on the Journal, who became bitter opponents when both were covering organized crime and the John Doe investigation for separate newspapers. This was the case with everybody on the staff for more than 33 years. And it was good for us, good for Milwaukee, and good for Wisconsin. Thank you.
Okay, well said, Paul. Now I'd like to bring up Jim Nelson to talk about what some of us was already pledged to support to keep this legacy going.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Nelson of the Journal Sentinel. I have enough former editors here that I feel assignments raining down on my head. Marta Bender, Dave Vogel, Katrinas, who else am I forgetting? Anyway, welcome to all of you to the Newsroom Pub, and special welcome to members of the Wills family. Raise your hands. I think there are a lot of you here. Let me be the first to say, to raise a glass. Here's to Mr. Wills, as Carl would say. Here, here. So, I'm a member of the MPC Endowment Board, and as has been alluded to, the Endowment Board is in rocking good shape. Thanks in part to, especially those of you who are of a certain age, about 10, 15 years ago, when I was president, we got an unexpected note from, I think it was from M&I Bank at the time, saying the press club was receiving a substantial contribution from a guy named Harold Gower. And this Harold Gower, he was a PR guy, I think he was briefly a journalist, but he made a contribution to the press club and left it in his estate. And it was a big one. And we put that money in the endowment, and it helped raise all of what's going on today with the Press Club endowment. It helped trigger the Don Walker Fund, we lost Don Walker, because friends of Don Walker realized, you know what, if we raise money for a scholarship in Don's name, it'll be in good hands in the endowment. Same with Eric Miller, same with Tim Caprisa, same with Meg Jones, which is coming up. And now, same with Mr. Wills. The endowment has created, thanks to Carl Miller, who made the first legacy gift, a Bob Wills Freedom of Information Fund. And for those who don't know, Mr. Wills was involved in the creation of the State FOI Council. Where's Bill? Bill Leaders is here from the council. And Dave Zwiefel, who has played a critical role in that organization as well. And this fund will be kept and overseen by the endowment board, but it will be used to advance the cause of freedom of information. We're not sure what we're going to do with it. You know, are we going to do legal defense funds? Are we going to do programming, or so on and so forth? We'll see how much we raise, and we'll see what the family members and contributors to this fund wish to do with it. But that's our big announcement tonight. There's a new fund in honor of Mr. Wills and in support of the free press. And I couldn't thank him more for creating that legacy. And David Niles is Roman. Where's David? He has his pocket PayPal thing. So contribute now and contribute often. And most importantly, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jim, for being a shameless fundraiser. So now we're blessed to have not only colleagues and other friends of Bob Wills, actually his two sons here tonight. We'd like to bring them up to offer us some. Three. Wow. Triply blessed. So, Bob, you want to come up first? And here's some interesting stories that were only told at home.
Everybody's been warning me that Carl's going to give me the hook. So my dad, you all know, he was a unique kind of individual, but he was also like the American dream, the Horatio Alger story. Everything that a person could want in life, he got. And so I was trying to think, how do you honor somebody like that? I would say, first of all, I'll tell you about what I think were the key things that he wanted. When he was growing up, Dad would go through an atlas and find the names of places that were interesting, and had a goal to get to them. And I think he got to all of them. So that was pretty cool that he managed to pull that off. He wanted to run the best newspaper. He had an inspirational, maybe a little bit creepy, English teacher in high school. When we hear the stories, we worry that I wouldn't probably send my kids to have her as my teacher. But she managed to inspire Dad to love the English language and to believe in grammar, and taught him to tell a story. And so even after he retired, Dad continued to write stories, and if any of you aren't on his distribution list, you should be. He, in his newspaper career, in his entire life actually, he had the good sense to not discriminate, and to look for the people who were the best and provided the most help. And he had people like Marta, who backed him all the time, who made things possible for him. He had people like Dolores Spangler, who I thought she was probably family. As he was working, he could never have done what he did in his career without her. And later in his career, later after retirement in the last few years, he had Roz Hart, who's here in the front, who helped as he became blind and couldn't see very well. She helped to bring his stories to life and enable him to continue to communicate when he was beyond able to do that himself. Dad grew up in the Depression. His father lost an automobile dealership when he was a child. They scraped by. But he used to tell about how his was the only house on the street where the hobos would come around the back door and stop because they knew they'd get a handout there. And he would look around and he could never figure out how they knew that was the house to stop at. And that was his curiosity. He always had to explain those kinds of things. But the Journal, not because of what they paid, but because every time they offered him stock, he bought it. Enabled him to gain a financial independence that he craved, and where he never had to think about money at his old age. And when he retired, he was the second largest stockholder, I believe, in the company. And that was a blessing to him because he didn't like thinking about this. And then the last thing was that he wanted to raise curious kids. And if you have a chance to talk to Mike or Ken and I think you'll discover that he did that. So every good presentation involves a script sheet. I can't read the back. How do I? Support freedom of the press, I believe. Ken designed this, and Dad was proud to be one of the people wearing it. So I just, I wanted to share a couple personal notes in addition to that summary of his life. After my mother died, I drove Dad from my brother's house in Pennsylvania out to his home in Nevada where he spent his winters. And it was really a blessing. I got hours and hours and hours of stories from him. But, a couple of them that really stick with me. One of them was that as we went across the Mississippi River and started into Missouri and we're coming down the road, I looked over and he had this really pensive look on his face. I could tell he was just somewhere else. And I said, Dad, what's going on? And he said, when I was a kid, we took one vacation. And my dad drove me down here to Lake Taneycomo, which is Lake of the Ozarks. And we went out trout fishing. But he said, I remember this spot. He said, growing up in central Illinois, I had never seen rocks. I'd seen them in books. I'd seen, I'd heard about rocks and layers of rocks, but we had 18 feet of topsoil probably. And so he said, I just remember looking at the striations in the rock as the road, where the road cut through it, and thinking, now I've seen rocks. So they got to the lake there and went fishing, and a big storm came up, and he was talking about how his father had rowed them over to a place where he'd seen a rock outcropping, and they could hide underneath it from the rain. And they survived the storm that way and tied the boat up. And he was so impressed with his dad, he was that aware of his surroundings to do that. And then they had to get towed away because the mud had made it so that their car, wanted to get out of where they parked it. But anyway, then the final story, on another one of these trips, we got to Rifle, Colorado. And when Mom and Dad were crossing the country at one point, they had a rock fell down in the interstate right in front of them, and they hit it and took the bottom, the exhaust system out of their car, and they were sitting on the road not knowing really what to do. And a guy from a landscaping company pulled up, and he had baling wire or something in his truck, and so he took that and patched things together until they could get into town to get their vehicle fixed. And so as we're going through, Dad said, I've got to find that guy. I got to thank him. He worked for a landscaping company. I'm sure we can find him. And so we went into the restaurant there, the Sunrise Cafe or whatever it was called, which I think now is owned by one of the craziest people in Congress. At the time, it seemed like a really nice cafe out there. And so we were asking around, nobody knew anything about this company, and so we went and looked in the phone book, got the people to pull out a phone book before cell phones. And we found an address, and we drove over to this address, and we walked up to the door, and it's clearly not a landscaping company. And Dad says, oh, well, we'll go in anyway. And I said, Dad, this isn't the right place. And he said, look, it's got a caduceus on there. Your grandfather had that on his, the pharmacist had that on his logo. And he said, so it's a drugstore, let's go in. And so we walked in, and it was a drugstore. But it had, there were a bunch of people lounging on couches inside. It was a different kind of drugstore. And while some of you have worked with them, may have the reaction I had that maybe this would be good for Dad. I think he just could not relate to the people that were around on couches. So we left there with little more information and never did find the place we were looking for. But Dad was, when he set his mind to something, it took us a long time before we left that town. So that's it for me. Thanks. Thanks all for coming. Thanks for sharing your stories. It's really wonderful for us to hear other people's experiences, and I hope some of you will stay around and talk. Thanks.
All right, who's up next? Is it Ken or Mike? Come on up.
First of all, thank you all for coming. It's really gratifying to us to know that that's had an impact on so many people, and we're really grateful. I wanted to also, Bob mentioned Roz, but Roz spent the last, how many years? 7 years with Dad, and she probably knew him better than anyone during that time. And I just want to raise a toast to Roz, who is truly a saint for what she was able to put up with during that time. He was not an easy man, even as you all know. Those of you who worked with him, he was not easy then, but he was maybe less easy to work with. Roz had an inordinate amount of patience, and we consider her part of the family now. So thank you, Roz. I think some of you know this story, but for those who haven't heard, I think it's informative to discuss, since we are all mortal, and sometimes we think about what will be remaining after we are gone. And at this, Dad was no different. At the Sentinel, there is a tradition that when new reporters were hired, their first assignment was to write their own obituary. Is that right? And you can imagine this was a little bit tough for some people. They come up with some creative endings, of course. But the stories would be put into the advanced obituary file, and for the day, hopefully long off, when it had to be topped with a new lead with the actual details of that reporter's demise. So one day, while Dad and I were chatting, we got around talking about this tradition, and I happened to ask him, did you ever read your obituary? And he said, yeah, I did, long ago. And he paused for a bit and said, I'm a little worried because they might change it. And he was concerned that he wasn't going to be the editor on the final story. And there might be mistakes. And so we had a chuckle and a laugh about this, the fact that even to the end, the last story, he wanted final control on that. And it was just a fun story. Fortunately, the three sons were able to meet with Dad in June for his birthday and Father's Day. So we feel very lucky that we had that time with him. We had cakes and laughs, and we were very fortunate. He was a lucky man. He lived a long life and died in his sleep. So we can't ask for too much more than that. Now, many of you knew him in the office, where he'd established, let's call it a forceful personality. At home, I'll give you some insight into how he was at the home's front. The three boys really only saw him on the weekends because was an evening paper. He would come home at 1, 2 in the morning after the paper was put to bed. And the 3 boys were already in their beds, and our beds. And we'd be sound asleep by the time he arrived. Now, Mom, whose job it was to nurture the kids during the week and guide our schooling, she'd make sure we were doing our homework. And she often suggested to Dad that Dad look over our homework assignments, taking advantage of having an editor in the house when we'd see him on the weekends. And so this terrified me. I gotta say, I came up with all kinds of excuses to avoid having him look at my papers from school. And for one thing, he really liked short sentences, right? Subject, verb, object, subject, verb. And there's a place for that. And I thought it just wasn't a place on my homework. And my mom would insist, and he'd get out his red pencil and start marking up my homework. And some of the things were spelling errors were a big pet peeve of his, as you know. And I would, to this day, I'm traumatized by one such infraction. And he was going over one of my papers, and he said, he's reading along, and all of a sudden he screws up his face and said, bellowed out, only an ass would spell occasion with 2 S's. I was mortified. 2 C's, 2 S's, what does it matter to me? But no, not in this house. Wow, I still get nervous around that word, but I never misspelled it again. Yeah, he was our weekend father, but his presence was immediately felt on Saturday mornings early, and he would start the day blasting some symphonic music, waking up the entire household and maybe the neighborhood with something like John Philip Sousa marches or Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture with cannons blasting and cymbals, and so we'd get up pretty early. He'd come marching down the hallway and give us our work assignments for the day, and Bob would shine my shoes. Mike, wash the cars. Ken, cut the lawn grass. And so we'd set out on our assignments, and then invariably Bob would negotiate with Mike and I. He'd say, if you do my job for, how about you pay you a nickel? And you shine the shoes, and at the time it seemed like a good deal. And one of us would take it, and then Bob would go off to his room and read some more, and that's why he ended up so smart. Anyway, if we happen to wake up in time to see him before he started barking these orders, you might catch him already reading the morning paper while brushing his teeth at the bathroom sink. Sometimes, see, I've avoided the word occasionally, he would exclaim at a particularly clever turn of phrase by one of his reporters, and he'd share it, talking with toothpaste in his mouth and some might dribble down his chin. We'd get a good lesson in writing. And during the weekdays, it was Mom's job to give him a once-over before he went out the house and made sure he didn't have toothpaste on his chin. There was never a downtime on the job for him. And even when he came back from vacations, he always left a day or two before Monday morning so that he could go back to read all of the papers, Journal and Sentinel, top to bottom, so that when he went back to work on Monday, he was up to speed on everything that happened while he was gone. It was amazing. He'd go through the stack of papers one by one, sometimes muttering out loud, and mostly making mental notes to talk about things to the staff when he got back to work. And the allure of journalism grew for me as I watched him preparing a speech or a story at home, clattering away on a manual Royal type, you guys remember those, right? Typewriter. He made that thing sound like a machine gun. And for a young kid, I used to perch myself on a sofa and just watch intently as he pounded away on that thing. And I would wonder, what could possibly possess a man to reach such a fever? At the end of the page, he might occasionally, one S, rip it out of the typewriter and crumple it up and throw it on the floor. And I thought, all that effort just to make a paper cannon. What would you do? Maybe that's what attracted me to the profession. Oh, by the time I learned to type, it was on an electric typewriter. Imagine that. Gen Zs don't even know what those are today. And they did away with all the contact sport nature of typing. Sometimes, avoiding occasionally. Dad's world of news ripped into our lives with alarm bells, literally. He'd reach home about 1 or 2 a.m., settle into sleep, and I remember not a few times when the home telephone would ring, waking us all up. And this, of course, was before cell phones. We had just one landline, a big, bulky, black telephone that was located in between the kitchen and the dining room, and the hallway that led down to the boys' bedrooms. Now, our parents' bedroom, wisely, was at the far other wing of the house, which meant that when the phone rang at 2 in the morning, Dad would have to jump out of bed, run to the other end of the house. And in those days, there was no voicemail or recording machines. The phone rang, and it would keep ringing until the person hung up or someone would answer. And so there was no way the boys were going to answer that, but man, were we awake. And Dad would eventually answer. Inevitably, it was the late duty editor calling about a change to the front page. So these were always calls of some importance. We'd listen intently from our beds, and as you know, Dad did not speak softly. One call that stands out in my memory was the shooting of Bobby Kennedy at a campaign event in California. And Dad and the person on the line discussed how to remake the front page, what to move off, and what the headline should say. The next day at school, I was a bit groggier than usual, but I felt secretly privileged when the teachers were all talking about the shooting, informing their students about the story. And I didn't say anything, but I thought to myself, I knew all that in the middle of the night. And maybe it was that feeling of being first to know, knowing what was happening in the background, all that went into informing the public that drew me to the field of journalism. And I don't know if you know this, but Dad tried to steer me away from becoming a journalist. Bob, by that time, had headed in the direction of being a lifelong student, a doctor of economics, international relations. Then he turned to studying law. No chance he was going to be a journalist. Mike had started on the path of becoming a medical doctor, a dream that I think started when he was in grade school. Last chance for someone to follow in Dad's footsteps was me. And by then, I had become a fairly fanatic swimmer, sometimes twice-a-day workouts, and when I wasn't swimming, I was playing or stirring up trouble with my best friend across the street. So I could guess secretly he was proud that I signed up for the high school newspaper, and maybe knowing that the teenage mind better than the teenager himself knew his mind, he applied a little reverse psychology on me by discouraging me from following in his profession. And I guess I took it as a challenge. In the end, maybe I should have followed his advice. Anyway, Bob turned out to be a better natural writer after all. Damn you. Despite his warnings about the journalism profession, he did feed my interest. I used to get letters at college from Dad. Inside would be a printout of an AP story or a newspaper clipping about some development in the news business. There would be a simple cover letter, a white sheet of paper on which was written, D, send to Ken. That was Dolores Spangler, of course. his secretary, actually more of a personal manager and maybe co-editor. Some might think that that was impersonal, but receiving that, I felt the whiff of a busy newsroom, bulletins and memos and phone calls and interruptions, and by the end of the day, I had read those stories and notes and memos top to bottom. A few times while I was in school in New York, Dad came to town for business on one reason or another. As we walked around the city, I was often struck by his childlike curiosity and powers of observation. His keen eyes would spot things that I'd walked past dozens of times and missed. And one time near Lincoln Center, he looked up and he pointed out some ornate decorative gargoyles on the side of buildings several stories above the street. And one of, these are the gems of New York City architecture. And he marveled at that. He also saw the world in a bit different way than most people, but he was always centered in his own certainty. He'd say, "Why aren't those people out home getting ready for work tomorrow?" As we walked home from an evening performance. The streets, of course, were full and bustling, and I just chuckled. Okay, I'm going to turn a little. I'm going to need a little audience participation on this one. I never was at the Sentinel during an election night, but I've heard tales that as the night progressed and tension would rise and the election returns were coming in and deadlines were approaching, and soon editors would have to make a call on various races and who was going to win that election. And it's a very competitive situation, and the time is coming close to an end. And I think I can feel the tension already. Some of you remember those nights too. Deadlines approaching, you need to get the copy in. And as I understand this, at certain times in this period, Dad would walk through the newsroom and start singing his old Methodist tune, "Bringing in the Sheaves." And it would immediately cut the tension as reporters and editors laughed and finished up their stories. Do I have that right? No? The tension continued. So I'd like to do a rousing chorus of "Bringing in the Sheaves." You all join me, please. Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, we will come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. You all feel better now?
Deadline in 5 minutes.
Yeah, get your copy in. All right. Dad always gave credit where credit was due, and when people complimented his children, he rightly gave attention to our mother. She selflessly gave up everything for her 3 sons. Even when Dad tried to surprise her by buying a fancy dress that she knew was too expensive, she'd scold him for being outlandish, and invariably, after trying it on and admiring it, she'd return it and return to our disciplined family budget that she commanded. She had started out working for an airline reservation service for TWA, later worked part-time for a local travel agent, and then volunteered at St. Joseph's Hospital, where 2 of her sons were born. But mostly she was chief home officer and head of child raising. Had she pursued a profession, she would have been a mighty force in her own right, and in some ways she was, though unheralded. She took Dad's earnings, invested it, and through tireless study, ended up making more money than he did. She dragged us to swimming practices at unhealthy hours of the morning, persevered through every form of lame excuse a lazy teenager could come up with to avoid the daily torture. And before the label Tiger Mom was popularized, she pushed us to do better, be better, and then gave us the space to make mistakes. She hated the relentless burden of feeding a family, a role that fell to her out of social convention in the 50s and 60s, as well as Dad's atypical schedule. But what I'll just finish with this. Mom and Dad were partners in their love of the North Woods. And they trekked up north every chance they could, every weekend. And on every summer vacation for nearly 10 years, we would go on canoe trips in the North Woods, the Quetico wilderness areas, and enjoy the smell of the fresh woods. And the Quetico Wilderness Outfitters would always send us off with a shout off as we headed out the pier, and it would be something like this. May your packs stay dry, and may the wind always stay at your back. And so I would like to raise a glass and say, Dad, with your trusted partner in the bow, I wish you and Mom smooth paddling, and may you both keep your packs dry, and by all means, keep the damn wind at your backs. Thank you very much.
Does anybody else from the family want to come up and keep your clothes on? I would recommend. If not, we're now at the open mic period, so I'll open it up to anybody who's got a will story, one story at a time that they want to tell. Looking once, looking. Dave. Dave's going to talk about the Freedom of Information Council, right, Dave?
I am.
Did a wonderful job in the Journal Sentinel alumni newsletter. So,
Bob Wills, as I think everybody here knows, was the person that actually made freedom of information paramount here in Wisconsin. And he worked his butt off to get the FOIC, the Freedom of Information Council, going. And it was, he was a very strict president. We all got our assignments and what we needed to do and the money we needed to raise and the fights we had to take. I succeeded Bob when, as the FOIC president when he was elected national chairman of the Society of Professional Journalists. And he decided he couldn't do both of those jobs and do them well, as he had absolutely insisted on doing. But I'll never forget, after I had been elected president at Bob's last meeting, about a week later he drove down to Madison from Milwaukee, and he brought with him this box full of files and correspondence that he had initiated as the FOIC president. He puts them on my desk. He puts his finger in my chest. He says, "You're the president now. Don't let it die." And I looked at him and I thought to myself, no, I wouldn't dare. And here we are today, all these many years later, and the FOIC is as strong as Bob intended it to be, and he will always be remembered by, especially among us, that continue this never-ending fight against secrecy in government, as a man who really made a difference for journalism in this state. Thanks.
Dave, we're not going to let it die, and that's all part of what we're committed to here. So, anybody else want to come up and tell a little story?
Bob Friday, retired from the Journal Sentinel. I have two stories, and it should take about a minute to tell both of them. One is, I got the same memo that Ken was referring to. I had sent a memo to Mr. Wills on some topic or another, and it came back with the hash sheet memo that was familiar in the Sentinel newsroom. from Dolores Spangler, and it said, "Mr. Wills would like to remind you that there is no ass in occasion." And like Ken, I have never misspelled a word since. The other one was, for a time the Sentinel had a once-a-year gathering of the staff that we called After Deadline. It was a time to sort of step back a bit, take a look. We got outside speakers to come in. It was like a day-long seminar kind of thing. And we were all there on our day off on Saturday, getting paid nothing. We got a dinner at the end. And at one point in the day, they would, open it up to the staff, and does anybody have any suggestions for improving the paper? And I came up with this stupid minor little thing. I said, we have this little item in the paper every day called People in the News. And it was, typical Hollywood gossip kind of stuff from the wires. But a copy editor spent a really long time condensing all these things into 2 tight paragraphs, maybe with a headshot, and there were maybe 4 or 5 items a day. And I said, they're working really hard at this. Why don't we give them a little credit line at the bottom? As a little reward just for all their efforts. His response took 1 sentence. He said, "Copy editors were born anonymous and will stay that way." Thank you.
Mr. Gillespie,
That's my dad.
I remember your dad, and when you're done, I'll tell a story about him.
I love that. Love that. I'm pretty sure that my dad knew Bob Wills before any of you because they worked together in Duluth, Minnesota before Bob came down to Milwaukee. And also that's the reason I live in Wisconsin. I didn't always thank him for that. But the story I want to tell is something about him as a human. When my dad had his first heart attack, I went to the hospital and it was supposed to be family only. And the nurse said, "There's 2 men in there." But I gotta say, since they got there, your dad seemed better. Well, take a guess who the 2 men were. One's pretty obvious, Bob Wills. Guess who the other one was? Jim Weehart. And it was quite a session. But the heartfelt part is, when my dad had his second heart attack, after spending the night putting the paper out, he was found at the front door with the keys to the house in his hands. And my brother Scott found him, some of you know Scott. But before I could get to the house, Bob Wills was there. And that's the man I remember.
Anybody else? All right, my story.
I'd just like to say though that on top of his story that Michelle Weehart was wanting to come here tonight and sent her greetings to most of you.
All right, thank you for that. Come on forward. All right. You can explain who you are.
Yeah, my name is Beth Knockreiner, and I'm friends of the younger Bob Wills. And I thought I had a story that would be funny to some of you in the business. So when I knew young Bob, his parents were looking for him. And young Bob, like my youngest son, liked at that time to kind of stay under the radar and maybe avoid his parents for periods of time. So I was actually working at the state capitol. I was chief of staff for one of the members there. And this gentleman shows up in my office, or in the senator's office, at about 6:30 at night. And he walks in and he says, "My name is Bob Wills. Does that name mean anything to you?" And so, yes, I know Bob Wills. Are you related? And he went on to say that he and his wife were looking for the younger Bob, so got on the phone, got a hold of Bob. They talked for a bit, and he said, "I've been tracking you for weeks." And of course, I didn't really know at that point in time what he was talking about. And but what I found out later is that he had Neil Shively at the time, who was doing the beat at the state capitol, trying to figure out who this person was, and of course he tracked me down. And the thing that that story really just relates to me is, well, two things. His curiosity was just something to behold. And in fact, I can't believe that the boys didn't tell you the stories about, I don't know, they got a buck or something for every story that they gave to their dad. That was like worth pursuing. But the other thing about him is just his intense affection and love and deep love for his family. So he was a lovely man, and I'm really happy to be here. So thank you.
Anybody else? All right, I'll tell the Bob Gillespie story. So, I was a young, new assistant city editor, and the job then at night was all the copy, we actually moved paper, would flow through the assistant, and you got to decide which stories you thought were important enough to give to the night city editor. So page one, or our home page, our local page, everything else you had to move it. It was about, Bob was having a rough time, I can't even remember why, but he was getting more and a little worked up, and you kind of see the blood pressure coming up his neck, and I'm watching him. All of a sudden he jumps up and he walks away. It's about, I don't know, 10 to 6, something like that. Gillespie's getting nervous because there's this pile of paper that I put on Will's desk. And Gillespie says, move the goddamn copy. So I'm not touching Mr. Will's copy, that's not happening. 5 minutes go by now, I can see Gillespie starting to get the blood pressure going, and Leo Kissel, news editor, started yelling at me, so okay, I grab the stuff and start moving it, and we get about past deadline, about 6:30, where's Mr. Wills? I get up, wander around the newsroom, look in all these places, back hallway, fire doors. Finally, I wind up in the men's room. There's Bob Wills standing over the sink with a nosebleed. He got himself so worked up, he literally started bleeding out of his nose. I'm looking at him, he looks at me and says, what do you want? I said, just want to let you know, Mr. Wills, I moved all the copy, including yours. Good. Never explained later what happened, right? But scared to death. Because, you know, screw something up, you're going to hear about it, right? But instilled in us, as a number of people pointed out, this kind of incredibly high standard of journalism. You're here to fight for open government, open records, and woe be it to you if you ever came back and said you couldn't get it done or you couldn't cover it. Right? And you were committed to being a journalist 24/7. So if you got the call at midnight, you're going to run out of town and cover the story, start packing your bag, and you're going to be gone, right? So why are we telling all these stories? There's a heritage here, there's a commitment to journalism that all the people in this room have shared one way or another. How do we keep that going in an age when the digital media is just taking over and newspapers and even broadcast media are declining in numbers? How do we keep it going? The Press Club is doing that. I give a lot of credit to the Board of Governors, bringing in people who are digital media people and maintaining those high standards. And then the endowment, of course, committed to not just education, but public awareness and advocacy for things like open records, open government. That fight goes on. In fact, it's more intense today than ever before. So without the Press Club and the people in it, woe be to us. So who knows where we'll be going, but we will remember our giants in journalism and maintain that legacy. So maybe with that, unless someone else wants to come forward, I'm told we can do more storytelling at the bar. The bar will be open and talk with each other, but I want to thank everybody for coming, and hopefully some of you will participate in the endowment's Will's Freedom of Information Fund. So thank you for coming.